Welcome back to Raw American History, where we uncover the stories that your school skipped, the ones that were simply too brutal, too messy, or too forgotten to make the history books. Today, we're going back to 1675, to a frozen swamp in what is now Rhode Island, where hundreds of men, women, and children were burned alive in one of the deadliest moments of early America. This is the story of the Great Swamp Fight, a massacre that would change the future of New England forever. By the 1670s, tension between the English colonists and native tribes in New England was at a breaking point. For decades, the settlers had been pushing further into native land, building towns, cutting forests, and claiming territory that had belonged to indigenous nations for generations. The peace that existed after the Pilgrims first landed was long gone, and at the center of that tension was Massacre, the leader of the Wampanoag people. The English called him King Philip. He was the son of Massacre, the same chief who had once welcomed the Pilgrims. But by now, friendship had turned into resentment. Massacre saw the English swallowing up his people's land, forcing them to live under colonial law, even converting them to Christianity. He finally decided to fight back. In the summer of 1675, war exploded across New England, what we now call King Philip's War. Native warriors attacked colonial settlements from Massachusetts to Connecticut, burning towns, ambushing militia, and killing settlers who had once been their neighbors. The colonists, though, struck back just as hard, destroying native villages and executing anyone they suspected of rebellion. But the war wasn't simple. Not every tribe sided with Massacre. Some, like the Narragansett people in Rhode Island, tried to stay neutral, at least at first. The Narragansetts were powerful, and both sides wanted their support. The colonists accused them of secretly sheltering Wampanoag warriors and refusing to turn over refugees from the fighting. Whether that was true or not, though, didn't matter. The English decided to attack first. In December of 1675, with the temperature below freezing and snow covering the ground, the colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Connecticut assembled a joint army of about 1,000 men. And these weren't just soldiers. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen carrying muskets, marching through the waist-deep snow toward what they believed was the Narragansett stronghold. The Narragansetts, unaware that the colonists were closing in, had built a fortified village deep inside the Great Swamp, a natural fortress surrounded by icy bogs and thick forest. Inside were hundreds of people, warriors, women, children, elders, and stockpiles of food for the harsh winter. On December 19, 1675, the Colonial Army reached that swamp. They hacked their way through the ice and underbrush, guided by native scouts who had sided with the English. And what they saw ahead of them was a small island rising out of the frozen swamp, covered with palisades and wigwams. This was the heart of the Narragansett Nation. The colonists attacked immediately. They stormed across the frozen bogs under fire, slipping, falling, shouting as musket balls ripped through the air. The Narragansetts fought fiercely, using every advantage of their terrain, firing arrows and muskets from behind the palisades. For nearly an hour, the colonists couldn't break through. Many were shot or fell into icy water and froze where they lay. Then, a group of Connecticut soldiers found a weak spot, a narrow log bridge across the swamp. They crossed it under heavy fire and forced their way through a gap in the palisade. And once they were inside, chaos erupted. The fighting turned into a massacre. The English soldiers began setting fire to everything, the wigwams, the food stores, the defenses, and while the battle still all raged on. Soon, the entire village was burning, flames roaring through the huts and smoke blotting out the winter sun. People tried to flee, but they were cut down as they ran. Women carrying babies were shot, the elderly were clubbed or burned alive in their homes. One colonial soldier later wrote that the heat of the fire and the smell was almost insufferable. By the time that the smoke cleared, the swamp was littered with bodies, both English and Narragansett. Hundreds of native men, women, and children lay dead or dying. The colonists counted around 70 of their own killed and more than 200 wounded, but the Narragansett losses were catastrophic. Historians estimate that between 500 and 1,000 people were killed in just a few hours. The survivors, those who weren't burned or shot, fled into the frozen wilderness, many dying of exposure in the following days. Their supplies were gone, their homes destroyed, and their nation effectively erased. When the colonial soldiers marched back through the snow, many of them limping and frostbitten, they believed that they had struck a decisive blow. They called it a victory, but in reality, they had unleashed something much darker. The attack pushed the Narragansetts, who had tried to stay out of the war, into full alliance with Metacom's forces. And for the next year, the fighting only grew more vicious. Towns across Massachusetts and Connecticut were burned to the ground, hundreds of settlers were killed, and entire native communities were wiped out in return. By the end of King Philip's War, nearly every native tribe in southern New England had been destroyed or forced off their land. Thousands were killed, thousands more were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. It was one of the deadliest wars in American history by percentage of population, and it all accelerated after that one day in a frozen Rhode Island swamp. For the colonists, the Great Swamp Fight became a symbol of divine victory. Proof, they thought, that God was on their side. They gave thanks in their churches and wrote letters home calling it a glorious success. For the Narragansetts, it was the end of their world. Their once powerful nation was gone, and the few survivors left were scattered and their stories only passed down quietly through generations, mostly ignored by the written histories that came after. Today, the site of the Great Swamp Fight is marked by a stone monument deep in the woods near South Kingstown, Rhode Island. Most people drive past without ever knowing what had happened there. And the swamp, it's quiet now, peaceful and still, but under that frozen ground lies one of the bloodiest secrets of early America. The Great Swamp Fight wasn't just a battle, it was an extermination. It showed what fear, greed, and vengeance could turn ordinary people into, and it set the tone for centuries of conflict that would follow between colonists and the native nations who stood in their way. Thanks for watching Raw American History. If you want to keep exploring the parts of America's past they never told you about, the brutal, the forgotten, and the real, then make sure to like, subscribe, and check out our next episode. We'll keep digging into the stories burned under the myths, one forgotten chapter at a time.